The individual recognized in historical records as King Edward III entered the world on November 13, 1312, at Windsor Castle, located in Berkshire, England. His father, Edward II, held the titles of King of England, Lord of Ireland, and Duke of Aquitaine in France. Edward II had ascended to the throne in 1307 at the age of 23, succeeding his formidable father, Edward I, also known as Edward Longshanks. Although Edward II had fathered a son, Adam Fitzroy, around the time of his ascension, this child was born out of wedlock. Consequently, the birth of the future Edward III in 1312 was met with considerable celebration, as it ensured the continuity of the royal lineage. Edward III's mother, Queen Isabella, was the offspring of King Philip IV of France. Born in 1295, she spent her formative years in various French royal residences near Paris before being wed to Edward II in January 1308. At the time of her marriage, she was merely 12 years old, and her husband, Edward, was just beginning what would be a notably turbulent reign. The England that welcomed the future Edward III in 1312 was marked by significant instability. Edward I, during his extensive reign from 1272 to 1307, had established one of Europe's most potent kingdoms. He had finalized the English conquest of Wales, engaged in Scotland, and broadened English dominion across the Irish Sea into Ireland. Additionally, he had overhauled the judicial and administrative systems, contributing to England's status as the most centralized state in Europe during the High Middle Ages. However, the creation of this highly centralized and expanded English state under Edward Longshanks posed a considerable challenge after his demise in 1307. His heir, Edward II, proved to be an ineffectual monarch, one who concentrated substantial authority in the hands of a succession of personal favorites throughout his two-decade reign. This practice engendered considerable animosity among the English nobility and the broader political community. The first of these favored individuals, Piers Gaveston, had cultivated a close bond with Edward around 1300 when both were still adolescents. The precise nature of their relationship, whether it was sexual or not, remains a subject of debate. Nevertheless, upon Edward's accession in 1307, Gaveston was endowed with vast powers, eventually becoming the first Earl of Cornwall and receiving numerous official positions. His conduct, however, deeply offended the nobility, compelling the king to exile him temporarily to Ireland, where he acted as the royal viceroy. Ultimately, upon Gaveston's return to England from one such exile, he was assassinated in the summer of 1312 by two prominent English nobles, the Earl of Lancaster and the Earl of Warwick. This event occurred mere months before the future Edward III's birth at Windsor Castle. Yet, the subsequent years did not witness any amelioration in the conditions of Edward II's rule. During the 1310s, the king began to exhibit a similar favoritism, previously shown to Gaveston, towards Hugh Despencer, the son and namesake of the Earl of Winchester. As the Despencer family's influence grew, the English nobility's resistance to Edward II's rule intensified. Furthermore, Edward I's territorial acquisitions in Scotland were reversed in 1314, when the English forces suffered a resounding defeat by a Scottish army under the command of Robert the Bruce at the Battle of Bannockburn. Adding to these woes, a famine afflicted England in the mid-1310s. Consequently, the England in which the future Edward III spent his infancy was fraught with turmoil, largely attributable to the inadequate governance of his father. Surprisingly, little documentation exists regarding his upbringing. However, the young Edward would have been completely unaware of the nation's condition during his formative years. Interestingly, he was never bestowed the title of Prince of Wales, a title typically conferred upon direct heirs to the English throne since the late 13th century. Instead, throughout his youth, he held the honorary title of Earl of Chester. A separate household, distinct from that of the king and queen, was created for Edward, and it was within this environment that he was brought up. Edward was also joined by several siblings during his youth. His brother John was born in August 1316, followed by two sisters, Eleanor and Joan, in 1318 and 1321 respectively. Edward might have received some of his education from Richard Barry, a renowned scholar of 14th century England. In any case, his education and upbringing would have emphasized the external physical world rather than the intellectual realm of books. He acquired literacy in English and French, but his proficiency in Latin remained rudimentary. He might also have gained some knowledge of Flemish and German. However, judging from Edward's later life, his primary focus during his youth would have been horsemanship and martial skills. This was, after all, the High Middle Ages, a period when a king's capacity to lead his people in warfare was deemed more crucial than his understanding of the intricacies of governmental administration. As he approached his 10th year, the political climate in England reached a critical juncture. In 1321, a civil war erupted in England, largely instigated by the king's persistent support and extravagant favors bestowed upon the Despencer family and their associates. This rebellion was spearheaded by Thomas, Earl of Lancaster, a first cousin of the king and one of the individuals responsible for the downfall of Piers Gaveston in 1312. Although the king managed to quell this insurrection the following year in 1322, and Lancaster was executed that March near Pontefract Castle, the tensions persisted. Hugh Despencer now held a dominant position within England, but he increasingly found a new adversary in the Queen herself, Isabella. Isabella had always harbored resentment towards her husband's favorites, but she had not openly clashed with Gaveston as she did with Despencer. In the 1320s, the situation was different. The Queen found herself at odds with her husband's favored individual, and as time passed, this increasingly strained her relationship with her husband, leading to an impending confrontation. Ultimately, it was developments in France that brought the political instability, which had characterized Edward II's entire reign, to a head. The kings of England had maintained territorial possessions in France since the Norman conquest of England in 1066. England's conqueror at that time was William, Duke of Normandy, the ruler of a substantial portion of northern France. The subsequent 2 centuries witnessed this continental empire expand to encompass additional territories in the southwest of the country, including the Duchy of Aquitaine, and then contract, resulting in the loss of Normandy and other lands. By the early 14th century, the kings of England retained only the Duchy of Aquitaine in France. This was a personal holding of the English Plantagenet monarchs, rather than an integral component of the English kingdom. Furthermore, because the duchy was a constituent part of the French kingdom, Edward II theoretically owed allegiance to the King of France. Until his death in 1314, this was Isabella's father, Philip IV. However, a series of short reigns followed, eventually culminating in the accession of Charles IV, Isabella's brother, in January 1322. It was this familial connection between the new French king and the English queen that sowed the initial seeds of Edward II's downfall in the mid-1320s. Shortly after Charles's accession in France, a dispute arose in Aquitaine in 1323, wherein an official of the French king was executed by the seneschal of the duchy, Edward II's principal representative there. In retaliation, Charles IV invaded the duchy, an action that prompted Hugh Despencer to have Isabella apprehended in England on the grounds of being a French alien within the country. Back in France, Charles IV reacted to the news of his sister's incarceration in her adopted homeland by dispatching an envoy to Edward II in England, suggesting that Isabella be sent to France as his ambassador to conduct peace negotiations. It was an unconventional proposition, but one to which the English king acquiesced. Isabella departed for France in March 1325. This marked the commencement of Edward II's decline. In France, Isabella encountered Roger Mortimer, an exiled English lord around whom a faction of Englishmen opposed to Edward II and the Despensers had gathered in France. The Queen and Mortimer would soon embark on a relationship. More significantly, in September 1325, the young Edward, Earl of Chester, the future renowned king, Edward III, was sent to France. The rationale behind Edward sending his 12-year-old son to continental Europe remains somewhat enigmatic. The most plausible explanation is that he was reluctant to journey to France himself and appear before Charles IV as part of the peace negotiations. During these negotiations, he would have been obligated to pay homage to Charles, a fellow king, but one to whom Edward was technically a subject in his capacity as Duke of Aquitaine. Accordingly, Edward appears to have conceived the idea of transferring the Duchy of Aquitaine to his 12-year-old son as a means of circumventing the acknowledgement of his subordinate status to the French king. Regardless of the underlying motives, it proved to be a grave strategic blunder. With the young Edward in France, the anti-dispenser faction of English nobles at the Gallic court in Paris, under the leadership of Isabella and Roger Mortimer, now possessed a viable contender for the English throne to present as a figurehead for a revolt. The magnitude of this error was soon realized in England, where the dispensers and the king issued a directive for the young Edward to be returned home. However, Isabella defied this order. Consequently, by the end of 1325, many of the essential prerequisites were in place for Isabella and Mortimer to attempt to overthrow Edward II's regime and the dispensers in England. However, Isabella's brother hesitated to provide assistance. Despite Charles IV's willingness to aid Isabella during her predicament in England, he was unwilling to endorse an invasion of England. Therefore, in the summer of 1326, Isabella, Mortimer, and their supporters, with the young Prince Edward in their company, journeyed to Hainaut, a small principality situated near the present-day border between France and Belgium. There, Isabella reached an accord with the Count of the territory, William I. In exchange for military aid, she would betroth Prince Edward to William's daughter, Philippa. He consented and furnished Isabella and Mortimer with several hundred soldiers. This modest force ultimately proved sufficient. In late September 1326, Isabella, Mortimer, and approximately 700 men disembarked in Suffolk. In the ensuing weeks, support for Edward II simply dissipated throughout England. Years of accumulated resentment towards his imprudent rule and the disproportionate favor he had bestowed upon the dispensers suddenly erupted. Most crucially, the city of London declared its allegiance to Isabella and Prince Edward. In mid-November, the king was apprehended in South Wales and placed under arrest at Kenilworth Castle, while the senior members of the dispenser family were captured and swiftly executed. Subsequently, the termination of Edward II's reign was concluded with a relatively peaceful sequence of events. On January 13, 1327, Parliament decreed that Edward II should be deposed in favor of his son and namesake. This resolution was presented to the king at Kenilworth, and with tears in his eyes he consented to abdicate on January 20th. The Crown Prince Edward was accordingly proclaimed as Edward III, King of England, Lord of Ireland, and Duke of Aquitaine in London on January 25th. A week later, he was formally crowned at Westminster Abbey. All of these proceedings were conducted in the name of the young Prince Edward, who had just celebrated his 14th birthday in November 1326. There is no doubt that Edward was merely a pawn at this juncture, and that actual authority in England resided with his mother Isabella, her lover Roger Mortimer, and their adherents. It had been stipulated by Parliament in January that the young king would govern in conjunction with a council comprising 4 bishops, 4 earls, and 6 barons of the realm. However, this arrangement was promptly disregarded by Isabella and Mortimer. The pair would effectively administer England for the subsequent 3.5 years. A multitude of challenges confronted the realm during these initial stages of Edward III's reign. The most urgent matter concerned the status of the former king, Edward's father. In the late spring of 1327, he was relocated to Berkeley Castle in Gloucestershire. However, a more enduring resolution was required. Isabella and Mortimer's regime was rapidly generating unrest, primarily due to dissatisfaction with the power Mortimer now wielded. This discontent was coalescing in certain circles around the notion of liberating the former king and restoring him to the throne. A definitive resolution to this issue was reached on September 21, 1327, when the man who had governed England for 2 decades as Edward II was discreetly assassinated on Isabella and Mortimer's orders at Berkeley Castle. An arguably even more significant problem confronted the new regime to the north. Perceiving the instability engendered by the overthrow of Edward II as an opportunity, the Scots, under the leadership of Robert the Bruce, had initiated a series of incursions into northern England and the Crown's possessions in Ireland. Consequently, in the summer of 1327, the young King Edward III embarked on his inaugural military campaign into the north. This campaign has become known as the Weardale Campaign, named after the River Wear, where a significant portion of it transpired, unfolding in July and August 1327. During this campaign, James, Lord Douglas, in collaboration with the Earls of Mar and Moray, led a contingent of perhaps as many as 10,000 Scots southward into northern England. Simultaneously, Isabella and Mortimer, as the newly ascendant power in England, recognized the potential of a successful campaign against the long-standing adversary of Scotland as an effective means of legitimizing their newfound control in young Edward's name. Thus, in mid-July 1327, they proceeded northward from York with their own forces to confront Douglas and the Scots. A period of 2 weeks of maneuvering ensued between the two sides, as they navigated northern England, attempting to ascertain each other's positions and secure a tactical advantage. Eventually, a standoff occurred near the River Wear, lasting for 3 days. Then, on the night of August 3rd and into the early hours of August 4th, the Scottish forces launched an attack on the English camp, penetrating to the very heart of the English royal encampment. In this critical moment, young Edward narrowly escaped capture by Douglas's troops. Although the ropes of the tent itself were severed, the young monarch remained unharmed and uncaptured. This represented the culmination of the Weardale campaign. The Scottish assault was repelled at its most perilous point, and although several additional days of back-and-forth skirmishes followed, the Weardale campaign ultimately proved inconclusive. In early 1328, the regime was compelled to stabilize the northern border by consenting to the Treaty of Northampton, whereby Edward relinquished the English crown's claim to the Scottish throne and acknowledged Robert the Bruce as King of Scotland. However, the campaign and the near-capture incident had ignited within Edward a fervent ambition to master the art of warfare. He resolved that he would never again find himself so vulnerable in the face of an enemy on the battlefield. To compound matters, concurrent with the relative failure of the Weardale campaign, a diplomatic incident, with unforeseen and far-reaching consequences, erupted in February 1328. On the first day of that month, the French king, Charles IV, Isabella's brother, passed away. He had only daughters as his progeny, and since it had been determined that a woman would not succeed him, this brought the direct line of the Capetian kings of France, who had ruled the country since the late 10th century, to an end. There were only 2 viable candidates to succeed Charles IV. Firstly, Edward III of England, who possessed the strongest claim, being a grandson of Philip IV, Isabella's father, the long-reigning King of France from 1285 to 1314. Secondly, Philip of Valois. However, Edward's claim was never seriously entertained in France, where the prospect of a foreign monarch governing France jointly with England was deemed unacceptable by the French nobility. Consequently, the claim of Philip of Valois, a direct descendant of Philip III of France, who had ruled between 1270 and 1285, was favored. He was formally proclaimed as King of France on April 1st, 1328, and crowned at Reims Cathedral as Philip VI on May 29th. It is crucial to bear in mind, when evaluating the subsequent events, that Edward did possess a superior claim to the French throne through his mother. Furthermore, as a king in his own right, he regarded Philip as a social inferior, merely a count. This conviction in his own divine right to rule and his superior claim would instill in Edward a profound determination to emerge triumphant from the impending conflict. In the interval between Philip's accession and his coronation at the end of May, a delegation arrived in Paris, dispatched by Isabella and Mortimer, to protest Edward's exclusion from the succession. However, despite their remonstrations, the French remained resolute. Eventually, after months of objections, Edward, now 16 years of age, journeyed to France in the spring of 1329 and rendered homage at Amiens Cathedral to Philip VI, acknowledging him as his sovereign in his capacity as Duke of Aquitaine. On the surface, this appeared to conclude the matter. However, the dispute over the succession would prove far more protracted and consequential than the apparent display of acceptance in 1329 implied. While these conflicts were brewing with both Scotland and France, Edward was maturing and cultivating his own autonomy. In November 1327, he had been wed by proxy to Philippa of Hainault, in accordance with the agreement Isabella had reached with Count William of Hainault, in exchange for his support in overthrowing Edward II in 1326. However, while Edward had been inclined to follow his mother's guidance on this and numerous other matters in 1327 and 1328, by 1329, he was asserting his own independence and becoming less amenable to allowing his mother and Mortimer to govern the realm. That year, associates of the young king transmitted clandestine communications to the papacy in Avignon, where a rival papacy to that in Rome had been established. These messages alerted the Avignon papacy to the fact that the king was not yet empowered to rule in his own right. Matters reached a climax in 1330. Adversaries of Mortimer had begun to disseminate rumors by this time, alleging that Edward II was still alive. A plot was uncovered to instigate an uprising in the former king's name, spearheaded by his half-brother, the Earl of Kent. However, what truly galvanized the young king into action were rumors that Isabella was pregnant with Mortimer's child. Concerns were articulated by Edward's advisors, notably a close confidant, William Montague, that a scheme might be undertaken by Isabella and Mortimer to usurp the throne from Edward. In this scenario, Mortimer, who was still married to his wife of nearly 30 years, Joan, would divorce her, subsequently marry Isabella, and the pair would place their own offspring on the throne. Following a confrontation at Nottingham Castle in mid-October 1330, Edward resolved to take decisive action. On the night of October 19th, the young king, still a few weeks short of his 18th birthday, accompanied by Montague and a dozen or so other companions, forced their way into Isabella and Mortimer's chambers at Nottingham. A scuffle ensued, resulting in the deaths of several of their attendants before the king had his mother and her lover apprehended. A parliament was convened in the subsequent days, and an announcement was conveyed to the political nation declaring that henceforth Edward would govern in person. Mortimer was conveyed to London, where he was accused and convicted without trial of various high crimes and misdemeanors. On November 29, 1330, he became the first individual to be executed at Tyburn, the site of numerous political executions in England in the centuries that followed. Edward spared his mother, but her political career was effectively terminated. In the aftermath of Mortimer's execution, she was dispatched to Windsor Castle, where she is rumored to have experienced a partial nervous breakdown. She remained there under house arrest until 1332, before being permitted to retire to Castle Rising in Norfolk. Here, she led an affluent, albeit largely sedentary existence for a quarter of a century. Her family maintained contact with her, and occasional discussions arose regarding her potential travel to France. However, Edward evidently hesitated to permit this to a mother who had favored Mortimer over her own son in the initial years of his reign. She adopted an increasingly devout lifestyle in her later years and became a nun of the Order of St. Clare shortly before her demise on August 22, 1358. With his mother and Mortimer now removed from the political landscape, Edward III was at liberty, from late 1330 onwards, to commence governing in his own right, precisely as he attained the age of 18. The ensuing years would witness numerous triumphs. While England had endured a quarter of a century of nearly ceaseless turbulence attributable to Edward II's ineffectual rule and the subsequent usurpation of the throne by Mortimer, Edward's reign would witness the restoration and expansion of England's power. Under his stewardship, the nation would ascend to a prominence unparalleled at any other juncture in the medieval era. This augmentation of English influence commenced in Scotland in the wake of the Treaty of Northampton, concluded in early 1328 between King Robert of Scotland and Mortimer and Isabella, acting on Edward's behalf. Robert had consented to acknowledge the territorial claims of several English border lords to lands in southern Scotland, notably Henry Percy and Henry Beaumont. However, minimal action was undertaken by Robert to actually transfer ownership of the disputed lands to these lords of northern England. Nor was this situation rectified by the minority government that administered Scotland from 1329 onwards, following Robert's death and the accession of his young son David II. As a consequence, these lords commenced agitating to acquire these lands in the early 1330s. Known as the Disinherited, they now began plotting to overthrow the Bruce dynasty in Scotland by reviving their support for the Balliol claim to the Scottish monarchy, the family that had been championed by Edward's grandfather, Edward Longshanks, over 30 years earlier. Consequently, Edward Balliol, the rival claimant to the Scottish throne, was brought over from France by the Disinherited lords under the leadership of Henry Beaumont. Simultaneously, they petitioned Edward III for authorization to undertake an invasion of Scotland. This request was denied, although perhaps with sufficient implicit endorsement of their endeavors that the Disinherited now resolved to initiate their own military action, independent of the king. In the summer of 1332, these lords launched a naval expedition from Yorkshire, which made landfall at Kinghorn in Fife, in eastern Scotland. Advancing inland, they secured a resounding triumph over the Scots at the Battle of Duplin Moor on August 11, 1332. The precise figures are subject to considerable uncertainty, but it is estimated that as many as 5,000 Scots perished, with minimal casualties for the forces of the Disinherited and the Balliols. 6 weeks later at Scone, Edward Balliol was crowned as King of Scotland, thereby initiating the Second Scottish War of Independence, which would endure for a quarter of a century. Edward had not directly supported the Disinherited and Balliol in their invasion of Scotland. However, a decision now needed to be reached regarding his stance towards the usurper. At a parliament convened in England at Westminster in September 1332, it was promptly suggested to Edward that the Treaty of Northampton, agreed upon in 1328, should be rescinded and Balliol's claim to the throne of Scotland recognized. To secure Edward's backing, Balliol even intimated his willingness to concede that Scotland would become a fief or vassal state of the English crown and would pay homage to Edward III. These offers notwithstanding, Edward was hesitant to commit himself to a potentially protracted war in Scotland. However, his hand was forced in early 1333 when Balliol was driven into northern England, having suffered a military setback at the Battle of Annan in December 1332. This confluence of circumstances now necessitated Edward to extend his full support to Balliol. The English Parliament and the government, encompassing the offices of the Exchequer and the courts, were relocated to York, where they would remain for the next several years. The young king aimed to reimpose English dominion over Scotland, a feat his grandfather had accomplished many years prior, but which had dissipated under Edward II's ineffectual reign. It serves as an indication of the single-mindedness and clarity of purpose with which Edward III pursued his objectives throughout his reign, that he simply relocated the organs of English government to the north of the country once he committed himself to the war in Scotland. The initial step to be undertaken was an attempt to capture the border town of Berwick, which was then under Scottish sovereignty. A siege was commenced by Balliol with Edward's backing in March 1333. The king himself arrived to conduct military operations on the border in the early summer. By this time, the garrison and inhabitants of the town had communicated to the government of David II, further north, their intention to surrender if military assistance was not forthcoming by mid-July. The response to this ultimatum from the citizens of Berwick would precipitate the first of Edward III's numerous significant military triumphs. The Guardian of Scotland during David II's minority, Sir Archibald Douglas, assembled a substantial army, estimated at upwards of 20,000 men, and proceeded southward to confront Edward's forces. They engaged in battle on July 19, 1333, at Halidon Hill, approximately 2 kilometers northwest of Berwick. Edward III initiated the Battle of Halidon Hill with a significantly smaller force. The English army comprised fewer than 10,000 men, whereas Douglas commanded approximately twice that number at Berwick. However, Edward's numerical disadvantage was partially offset by his strategic positioning. He had chosen Halidon Hill specifically for its commanding view of the surrounding terrain and had resisted all inducements to relocate, even when Douglas conducted raids further south into northern England in the days preceding the battle. The English also possessed superior military capabilities, a factor that would prove advantageous to Edward not only at Halidon but also on numerous other occasions in the ensuing years. Of paramount importance here was the utilization of the 6-foot-long longbow, capable of unleashing volleys of iron-tipped arrows that could penetrate chainmail armor in rapid succession. This was a considerably more potent projectile weapon than the cumbersome crossbows that were the mainstay of most European armies in the early 14th century. The widespread adoption of the longbow was merely one element of the military revolution that Edward III spearheaded in the mid-14th century. The battle at Halidon Hill began around midday. Despite their numerical superiority, the Scots were compelled to advance up Halidon Hill, where Edward's armies held the high ground. It would have been prudent for Douglas to avoid engaging Edward while he maintained this advantageous position. However, with the ultimatum issued by Berwick to the Scottish government set to expire the following day, Douglas had little choice but to attempt to relieve the town before it capitulated to the English besiegers. The outcome was an utter rout. The English longbow was employed with devastating efficacy, decimating the Scottish ranks as they endeavored to ascend the hillside. Ultimately, the Scottish forces fractured, and the English, under Edward's leadership, advanced downwards, pursuing the fleeing Scots towards the sea. By the day's end, thousands of Scottish soldiers lay dead, possibly as many as half of Douglas's 20,000-strong army. Douglas himself and 5 Scottish earls perished during the battle. Halidon Hill represented an immense triumph for Edward, one of the most substantial victories ever achieved by an English force against the Scots. It also initiated the development of Edward's reputation throughout Europe as a formidable military commander. Furthermore, English military prowess was now in the ascendancy, whereas previously, English armies had been perceived on the continent as distinctly inferior to their counterparts in France and other regions. Politically, the victory positioned Edward in an exceptionally advantageous situation in Scotland. Berwick promptly surrendered, and numerous Scottish magnates pledged their allegiance to the English king in the subsequent days and weeks. More significantly, Balliol was reinstated to the Scottish throne. In February 1334, he consented to cede 8 counties, encompassing the entirety of southern Scotland below the Firth of Forth and the Solway Firth. Subsequently, in June 1334, Balliol paid homage to Edward as his liege lord at Newcastle. David II and his adherents sought refuge in France, completing a whirlwind campaign in which Scotland had been almost entirely brought under English dominion within a mere 18 months. Thus, by mid-1334, the northern frontier appeared to have been secured in a manner not witnessed since the era of Edward Longshanks. However, where Edward III achieved success, his erstwhile ally, Edward Balliol, seemed perpetually deficient. No sooner had Edward reinstated him in Scotland than Balliol managed to incite another rebellion in the summer of 1334. He was swiftly compelled to flee Scotland once more, again prompting Edward to intervene on his behalf. Late in 1334, and into 1335. In 1336, Edward would even conduct military operations into the Highlands, but his incursions continued to engender resistance. Consequently, by 1337, Scotland remained somewhat unstable, and the war would persist for many years. Nevertheless, there is little doubt regarding the overall success of Edward's policies towards Scotland in the 1330s. He established England on a more secure footing in the north than it had enjoyed for 3 decades and secured territorial concessions along the border. Most notably, he captured Berwick, which would henceforth remain an English stronghold on the Scottish border, with the exception of a brief interval in the 15th century. Moreover, Edward might well have proceeded to establish even greater dominion over Scotland had it not been for other matters diverting his attention elsewhere in 1337. This distraction would originate in France, and the ensuing repercussions would have consequences for both England and France that would resonate for over a century. The underlying causes of what has come to be known as the 100 Years' War can be traced to the earlier demise of Charles IV in 1328 and the termination of the Capetian dynasty in France. As previously discussed, Charles's death precipitated the accession of Philip of the House of Valois as Philip VI of France in the spring of 1328. In actuality, Edward possessed a stronger claim to the French throne. However, the French nobility had swiftly opted to endorse Philip's accession, being unwilling to be governed by an English foreigner. Isabella and Mortimer had reluctantly conceded to this situation and dispatched Edward to France in 1329 to pay homage to Philip in his capacity as Duke of Aquitaine. However, the matter did not conclude there, and would be resurrected in subsequent years once tensions created an opportune moment for the issue of the succession to be revisited. In many respects, it was the conflict in Scotland that furnished Edward with the opportunity to renew his claims in France. France and Scotland were enduring allies throughout the late medieval period, this Auld alliance being forged from their mutual antagonism towards England at various junctures. It is therefore unsurprising to discover that David II and his advisors had sought refuge in France following Edward's triumph at Halidon Hill in 1333. Over the subsequent few years, as Edward endeavored to fully subjugate Scotland, Philip VI of France extended substantial support to David's cause. This reached its zenith in 1336, when a massive French invasion of Scotland was contemplated. However, Edward was able to avert this possibility by devastating the coastal regions of Scotland, incinerating crops, and rounding up livestock. No French army could land there, if it would be unable to procure sustenance for itself in the ensuing weeks, and thus the invasion was aborted. Other controversies contributed to a further deterioration in relations between France and England in the mid-1330s, most notably the sanctuary that Edward provided to Philip VI's cousin and sworn enemy, Robert, Count of Artois, in England. However, ultimately it was the most straightforward pathway to the outbreak of conflict that precipitated the 100 Years' War. Edward's most vulnerable territory lay within France itself. On May 24, 1337, Philip VI formally declared that he was confiscating the Duchy of Aquitaine from Edward. Late that summer, the Count of Eu was dispatched into the Gascony region with an invasion force, which wrought havoc upon the countryside but failed to seize the duchy's principal town of Bordeaux from the English inhabitants. This invasion constituted the inaugural military action of a war that would endure for over 100 years. Once the war commenced in 1337, Edward and England were immediately confronted with a tactical dilemma. Aquitaine was situated in the southwest of France and was relatively challenging to supply from England. Consequently, Edward's strategy from the very outset of the war was to strike at the French by assaulting Philip VI's possessions directly across the English Channel in northern France, and to utilize territorial acquisitions here as a means of compelling the French monarch to cease his attacks on Aquitaine. Yet, there were inherent challenges with his methodology as well. As he had recently done in Scotland, Edward would endeavor to employ a strategy of burning and pillaging the French countryside as a means of coercing the French to the negotiating table and securing a strategic advantage. However, his approach may have been more counterproductive than beneficial. This type of scorched earth policy could frequently yield the diametrically opposite outcome, instilling instead a profound antipathy towards Edward and his armies among the common populace of the regions they were brutalizing. As such, it did not serve to win over these areas, but rather solidified their allegiance to the French in the long term. Even this strategy, however, presented its own set of limitations, primarily concerning the logistics of transporting an army to northern France. By the mid-14th century, the English merchant fleet was considerable, but the vessels of the era were diminutive, and it would prove exceedingly arduous to transport an army of the magnitude Edward would require to achieve military triumphs in northern France. This was the predicament that confronted Edward in 1337 upon the eruption of hostilities with France. The solution that emerged mirrored a strategy that Edward's grandfather, Edward I, had implemented in the 2900s. He sought support among the numerous princes and rulers of the Low Countries and in Germany. Consequently, in the summer of 1337, the young king, still a mere 24 years of age, dispatched the Bishop of Lincoln, Henry Burghersh, and his close ally, William Montague, recently ennobled as the Earl of Salisbury, to Europe. Alliances were swiftly negotiated in the subsequent weeks with Hainaut, Gelders, and Brabant in the Low Countries, and most significantly with Louis, Duke of Bavaria, the reigning Holy Roman Emperor. Overall, Burghersh and Montague were able to secure commitments from these rulers to furnish approximately 7,000 troops to aid Edward in France, in addition to shipping and other logistical support, to facilitate the transport of the 10,000 men that Edward intended to bring across to France himself. This meant that a force of nearly 20,000 men would be deployed in northern France. However, these alliances were not without their price. Louis and the other princes had been promised substantial financial subventions from England to defray the costs of mobilizing their armies. These amounted to £124,000 alone by the end of 1337, a considerable sum for its time, equivalent to several times Edward's annual income. Consequently, Edward was compelled to borrow extensively from the merchant banking families of Italy in the initial stages of the war to finance the alliance he had forged. New taxes were also levied in England, and Parliament was persuaded to grant Edward a substantial subsidy or one-time payment. This latter development was noteworthy. Although some historical narratives tend to portray the manner in which monarchs such as Edward III, and earlier his grandfather Edward I, had recourse to Parliament for subsidies and financing as a self-indulgent exploitation of Parliament, such recourse was, in fact, fundamental to the evolution of the English parliamentary system. It was an established understanding in late medieval and early modern times that parliaments were convened when the reigning king or queen required funding from the political nation, and the political nation in turn could articulate its grievances and requests to the monarch. Edward's utilization of Parliament in this manner actually facilitated the gradual development of the Mother Parliament in the 14th century. Eventually, Edward embarked with his armies from England on July 16, 1338, and traversed Antwerp in the subsequent days with nearly 5,000 men. A meeting ensued on September 5th at Koblenz on the River Rhine in Germany between Edward and Louis of Bavaria, during which the Holy Roman Emperor conferred upon the English king the title of Vicar General of the Empire, a prestigious designation that theoretically placed the military resources of the entire empire at Edward's disposal. With this title secured and his armies largely assembled in the Low Countries, Edward was finally poised to engage in military operations in northern France in 1840, the spring of 1339. However, this inaugural year of active campaigning was marked by a degree of frustration, as Philip VI declined to engage Edward in direct combat. An encounter at La Capelle in northeastern France in October represented the closest they came to meeting on the battlefield, and this proved to be a largely inconclusive clash. Perhaps it was owing to his frustrations with this initial year of military campaigning that Edward now made the momentous decision to resurrect his claim to the French throne. Up until early 1340, his stated rationale for being in France was to safeguard his possessions in Aquitaine. However, this changed in January 1340. The decision may have been influenced by a new ally of Edward's, Jacob van Artevelde, a native of Ghent, who had ascended to become the preeminent political figure in the towns of Flanders in what is now modern-day Belgium. Van Artevelde pledged Flanders' support to Edward in 1339 and persuaded the English monarch to revive his claims to the French throne, a prerogative that Edward formally articulated on January 26, 1340, when he first commenced utilizing the title and arms of the kings of France. Edward's decision to claim the French throne was arguably his most renowned and enduring act in a lifetime characterized by innovations and accomplishments. The monarchs of England would assert their claim to the French throne until 1802. More immediately, it provided England with a justification to intervene on the continent in a manner that would enable the English state to maintain a foothold in France until the middle of the 16th century. Having asserted his claim to the French throne at the commencement of 1340, the focus of the war shifted that year to the naval campaign in the English Channel. Philip VI had been amassing an impressive fleet in the early phases of the war, which, with contingents furnished by his ally, the Kingdom of Castile in Spain, totaled slightly over 200 ships by the summer of 1340. The English fleet was being rapidly augmented, and by the time a decisive engagement occurred in 1340, it had reached approximately 150 vessels. The pivotal naval engagement of this period of the Hundred Years' War transpired at Sluys off the coast of Flanders on Midsummer's Day, June 24, 1340. Here, the numerically inferior English fleet managed to engage the French ships from relatively close proximity. Consequently, the English longbow, which had been employed with such efficacy in Edward's armies since Halidon Hill in 1333, was utilized with devastating impact. By evening, it is estimated that as many as 18,000 French mariners and soldiers had perished, and all but 23 of over 200 French ships had been either destroyed or captured, while all of the French senior naval commanders had lost their lives. Edward demonstrated here that he was not merely a military commander on land, but also capable of securing substantial victories at sea. Indeed, he had been in the thick of the fighting himself and sustained a wound from an arrow in the thigh. Sluys was a truly significant victory for Edward. It secured English dominion over the English Channel for years to come, and ensured that the south of England was shielded from any potential naval incursions throughout the mid-14th century. However, a challenge now confronted Edward that could not be vanquished in a land or naval battle. The financial burden of the war had escalated considerably. Accordingly, in November 1340, a few months after the triumph at Sluys, Edward surreptitiously returned to England to confront the government, which he had entrusted with the management of affairs during his absence, regarding the financial predicaments. Notably, the Archbishop of Canterbury, John Stratford, was initially incensed, but a reconciliation of sorts was eventually forged between the two in 1341, as Edward's attention was once again drawn to Scotland. While the war had been raging in France in the late 1330s and into the early 1340s, developments in Scotland had necessarily receded in Edward's hierarchy of priorities. However, the conflict there had never been fully resolved. Indeed, David II, by now approaching his late teens and cultivating his own autonomy as a claimant to the Scottish throne, had returned to the country from France in the summer of 1341. Both Edinburgh and Stirling had swiftly been seized for the Bruce cause thereafter. These occurrences now demanded Edward's attention, and in the autumn of 1341, he once again prioritized Scotland, conducting military operations on the Anglo-Scottish border throughout the winter of 1341 and 1342. Yet, while Edward might have desired to divert his focus in a sustained manner towards Scotland, before long, the war in France reasserted itself as the paramount concern. In April 1341, John III, the Duke of Brittany, the ruler of the Duchy of Brittany, a substantial fiefdom in the extreme northwest of the country, passed away without a designated heir. The succession dispute that ensued presented an opportunity for Edward to ascertain whether his claim to the title of the Crown of France held any sway within France. To this end, Edward championed the claim of John de Montfort, a relative of the recently deceased Duke, through his niece, while King Philip VI of France was advocating the claim of Charles, Count of Blois, to succeed to the duchy. Thus commenced what is known as the War of the Breton Succession, a significant component of the broader Hundred Years' War, and one that would persist in its own right for the ensuing quarter of a century. In the immediate context, the war in Brittany afforded Edward an advantageous opportunity to persist in challenging Philip's authority in France, an opportunity he exploited with considerable skill in the years ahead. The War of the Breton Succession continued unabated into the mid-1340s, and it was this localized conflict that served as the pretext for Edward to commence preparations for a major new invasion force in England in 1345. It would be the following year before it ultimately embarked for France, but when it did, the campaign of 1346 would yield some of the most momentous engagements of the entire Hundred Years' War, and some of Edward's most celebrated military triumphs. The precise objectives and purpose of the 1346 expedition to France were largely shrouded in secrecy while it was being prepared in England in the early part of the year. Indeed, it remains unclear whether a specific strategy was conceived from the outset, or whether the approach was ultimately determined and refined in response to developments in France. Irrespective of the overarching plan, the actual sequence of events is well documented. Edward's army, comprising between 12,000 and 15,000 men, disembarked on the Cotentin Peninsula in Normandy on July 12, 1346. His objective was to undertake an extensive chevauchée, or military raid, across French territory, a strategic approach that Edward became particularly partial to in 2008 France, and which constituted another pivotal element of the military revolution that Edward implemented amongst the English armed forces in the mid-14th century. The campaign proved enormously successful in the ensuing weeks. The first major strategic triumph occurred on July 26th, when the town of Caen in Normandy was seized by Edward. A sack of the city ensued, lasting for 5 days, before Edward's forces proceeded westward, the route to Paris now lying unobstructed. As substantial as the sacking of Caen had been, however, the principal military achievement of Edward's 1346 campaign transpired a month later. As the English king advanced towards Paris, Philip VI was frantically mobilizing his forces to safeguard the French capital. By mid-August, the French monarch had amassed an army consisting of well in excess of 20,000 men, which significantly outnumbered Edward's forces, which numbered approximately 12,000 men by the late summer. Meanwhile, Edward had circumvented Paris and veered northward towards Flanders, where he aspired to unite with some of his erstwhile allies from the Low Countries. Consequently, when the two monarchs finally clashed on August 26, 1346, it was far to the north of Paris near Calais, in the vicinity of the town of Crecy en Poitiers. The Battle of Crecy on August 26, 1346, would prove to be one of the most consequential engagements of the entire Hundred Years' War. Upon receiving intelligence that Philip's army was in close proximity, Edward positioned his own forces on the elevated terrain on the right bank of the River May as it flowed past the village of Crecy. The utilization of the high ground had served Edward advantageously at Halidon Hill, and it would do so again here. The English forces were organized into 3 units, one of dismounted close combat fighters under Edward's personal command, flanked on either side by 2 divisions of longbowmen. The French assault commenced late in the afternoon and would prove disastrous. The favored French projectile weapon, the crossbow, proved markedly inferior to the English longbow, and a division of French crossbowmen swiftly disintegrated under sustained English longbow fire. Philip then endeavored to dispatch his cavalry directly up the hill towards the English center. But akin to the Scottish forces at Halidon Hill, the French cavalry was utterly overwhelmed by sustained longbow fire from the English as they attempted to surmount the elevated terrain. By the time the cavalry charge reached Edward's arrayed close-quarters infantry division, they were already severely debilitated. The ensuing clash was an exceedingly sanguinary affair, with the French sustaining heavy casualties. By the time the French disengaged and retreated from the field in defeat, towards dawn on August 27th, approximately 4,000 French soldiers had been slain, while only a few hundred of Edward's troops had been lost. If any uncertainty persisted by 1346 regarding the superiority of the English longbow over continental methods of warfare and the utilization of the crossbow as a projectile, the Battle of Crecy dispelled that doubt. It also solidified Edward's reputation as one of the preeminent military commanders of Europe, having comprehensively vanquished the French king despite being outnumbered by nearly 2-1 at the commencement of the engagement on August 26th. Significantly, Crecy was also noteworthy for the deployment by Edward's forces of a small number of cannons, the first documented instance of the utilization of artillery in a field battle in Western Europe. The immediate ramification of Edward's astounding triumph at Crecy was that northern France now lay largely undefended. Consequently, Edward directed his forces towards the nearby town of Calais and initiated a siege on September 3rd. It would require nearly a full year to capture the northern French port, but eventually, on August 3rd, 1347, it capitulated. This must surely be regarded as one of Edward's most monumental accomplishments. Calais would remain under English dominion for over 2 centuries, only ultimately being reclaimed by the French in 1558. The victory at Crecy and the commencement of the ultimately successful siege of Calais were not the sole significant successes that Edward's England was experiencing in the late summer and autumn of 1346. While the king was in France, the conflict had persisted on England's northern border with Scotland. In the early autumn, David II now endeavored to capitalize on Edward's absence on the continent by invading northern England. It would prove to be a catastrophic miscalculation. He was encouraged in this endeavor by Philip VI, who exhorted his Scottish ally to honor their alliance by attacking England. On October 17, 1346, David II's forces, numbering approximately 12,000 men, clashed with an English force of just slightly over half the number David commanded in the field, at Neville's Cross near Durham. The English forces, under the leadership of Lord Ralph Neville, comprehensively routed the numerically superior Scots. Perhaps as many as 2,000 of the Scottish army's troops were slain, but most ominously, David II was captured by Neville's forces. Thus, by the autumn of 1347, Edward's fortunes were soaring. In France, he had secured a resounding victory over Philip at Crecy in the late summer of 1346, and followed it up a year later by capturing the town of Calais. In Scotland, the De Bruce contender to the throne had been apprehended, leaving Edward in an exceedingly potent negotiating position, both in France and Scotland. To solidify his standing, Edward arranged a 9-month truce in October 1347 and embarked for England in triumph. It was during this peak of accomplishment back in England, throughout the winter of 1347 and 1348, that Edward chose to implement an idea he had been contemplating since at least 1344. Captivated by the legend of King Arthur and his Round Table, Edward had long harbored aspirations of establishing his own Round Table and knightly order. In 1344, he had even initiated construction on a headquarters for such a knightly order at Windsor Castle. Now, with his military fortunes flourishing in both France and Scotland, he decided to implement a version of this plan. This was to be a knightly order dedicated to St. George, named for the sword belt that the knights of the order would bear. Thus was established the Order of the Garter, a chivalric order that remains the most prestigious order of knighthood in the British honor system to this day. The order's emblem is a garter bearing the motto Honi soit qui mal y pense, which, translated from Middle French, signifies "shame on him who thinks evil of it." This phrase is reputed to have been spoken by King Edward at court when the Countess of Salisbury's garter slipped from her leg during a dance. The king uttered the words as a reproof to some courtiers who were mocking the incident, and thus his words became symbolic of chivalrous honor. However, this narrative is likely apocryphal, as no actual written record of this version of events exists until the 1460s, over a century after the order's founding. At the time of its inception, the Order of the Garter comprised Edward himself and 25 knights. Many of those among the founding knights are unsurprising. For instance, Edward's eldest son and namesake Edward, known as the Black Prince, was one of the inaugural knights, as was Henry, Earl of Lancaster, and several of the most prominent nobles of the realm and supporters of Edward's cause, such as Thomas de Beauchamp, 11th Earl of Warwick, Jean de Grailly, Ralph Stafford, 1st Earl of Stafford, William Montague, 2nd Earl of Salisbury, John de Lisle, 2nd Baron Lisle, Bartholomew Burghersh, 2nd Baron Burghersh, John de Beauchamp, 1st Baron Beauchamp, John de Mohun, 2nd Baron Mohun, Thomas Holland, 1st Earl of Kent, and John Grey, 1st Baron Grey. However, one or two unexpected figures were present among the first knights of the Garter. In particular, the inclusion of Roger Mortimer, 2nd Earl of March, appears an unusual choice. This was the grandson of none other than the attempted usurper of Edward's royal authority in the late 1320s, Roger Mortimer, who was executed at Tyburn in 1330. This younger Mortimer had been rehabilitated in the early 1340s, partly due to his friendship with the Black Prince. Completing the roster of the inaugural members of the Order of the Garter were Sir Hugh Courtenay, Sir Richard Fitzsimon, Sir Miles Stapleton, Sir Thomas Wale, Sir Hugh Wriothesley, Sir Neil Loring, Sir John Chandos, Sir James Audley, Sir Otho Holland, Sir Henry Eame, Sir Sanchez d'Abrichecourt, and Sir Walter Pavely. Many of these individuals had accompanied Edward on his campaign to France in 1346, and it seems relatively evident that the order was created in 1348, in part, as a means of commemorating the significant victories Edward had achieved at Crecy and Calais. Concurrent with the establishment of the Order of the Garter, Edward commenced an extensive reconstruction of Windsor Castle. Aware of the propaganda value of an imposing royal residence, Edward supervised the most substantial expansion of the primary royal residence of the High Middle Ages, ultimately expending £50,000 on the new complex. This was the most costly building project undertaken by any English monarch during the medieval era, and yet it was merely one of many grand residences to which Edward could lay claim. For instance, he had inherited Woodstock Palace in Oxfordshire, a vast royal dwelling in Oxfordshire that King Henry I had constructed, and where the Black Prince was born in 1330. Woodstock would later become the location of Blenheim Palace. However, just as Edward's reign was reaching its apex, it was struck by a calamity, one that Edward was powerless to prevent. The bubonic plague, or what is more commonly known as the Black Death in its 14th century manifestation, arrived in Europe in 1347, having been conveyed to the continent from the Black Sea region, where it was harbored in the fleas that infested black rats. These were transported to Western Europe in 1347 aboard the ships of some Genoese merchants who held trading concessions in the ports of Crimea on the northern shores of the Black Sea. Bubonic plague induces a horrific illness and death. During the first week of infection, the afflicted individual develops flu-like symptoms, including fever, headache, and vomiting. Subsequently, the individual's lymph nodes begin to swell, forming what were known in the 14th century as buboes, typically on the neck, armpits, and groin, or where one had been bitten by the fleas carrying the plague. These buboes would eventually rupture, and gangrene would develop in the extremities of the body, such as the fingers, toes, and the tip of the nose. Death, when it occurred, however, would be attributable to organ failure, as the disease ravaged the body internally. Estimates of both the population of Europe at the time and the mortality rate of the plague are notoriously inexact. However, it is generally accepted that between 1347 and 1351, the Black Death claimed the lives of as many as 30 million people in Europe, approximately 1/3 of the continent's population. The plague reached England in the late summer of 1348, and the first documented cases in London occurred in October. Edward was fully cognizant of its lethal potential as his 14-year-old daughter, Joan, had succumbed to the disease in Bordeaux, France, around the time the disease first manifested in England in the summer of 1348. Consequently, like many other English monarchs after him, Edward departed London and spent much of the ensuing months in less densely populated areas where this catastrophic plague was circulating less virulently. This was, in effect, a form of medieval quarantine. The Black Death engendered immense hardships in England, not only in terms of the sheer magnitude of mortality and suffering it inflicted, but also in terms of the social and economic disruption the pandemic unleashed. A parliament that had been scheduled for 1349 was cancelled, and the courts were adjourned for months. Meanwhile, mass graves were excavated to inter the deceased, and the country began implementing quarantine and sanitation measures as effectively as a medieval state could. Although such measures appear relatively rudimentary by contemporary standards, recent events of the 21st century have underscored how crucial simply quarantining and removing the still diseased bodies of the dead are to resolving any pandemic. Edward's government was efficient in doing so after the initial onslaught of 1348. However, the most urgent concern in the aftermath of the first calamitous wave of the disease was the matter of labor shortages. With the continent's population drastically diminished, a scarcity of manpower would plague the European economy for decades to come. However, this crisis was mitigated in England through one of Edward's most understated yet significant accomplishments. In the summer of 1349, a preliminary ordinance regulating labor was issued by the king, and this was followed up in 1351 with the Statute of Laborers. Through this, the labor market was regulated by fixing wages at their pre-plague levels, ensuring that the English economy could continue to operate, even with a severe labor shortage in the 1350s. Although it may lack the prominence of Edward's military conquests, the enactment of the Statute of Laborers was a profoundly significant aspect of Edward III's reign. It stabilized the English labor market in the period of turmoil that ensued from the Black Death, and through it, England was the only nation in Europe that was able to implement effective labor controls in the 1350s. There is some debate regarding its efficacy, though, and historians have also highlighted the fact that the statute did generate social tensions and unrest among workers who perceived themselves as being unfairly disadvantaged in a labor market that was favorable to them in the aftermath of the plague. Furthermore, enforcement of the Statute of Laborers at the local level in England was largely entrusted to the justices of the peace, judicial officers who enforced the laws at the county level. These officers already existed prior to the emergency precipitated by the Black Death, but the 1350s witnessed them acquiring greater authority and significance as local officers of the crown. Consequently, Edward not only oversaw the stabilization of the labor market in the aftermath of the Black Death through the Statute of Laborers, but the method by which this was achieved saw the office of the Justice of the Peace begin to emerge in its modern form. The Justices of the Peace would occupy a crucial position in English local government for centuries to come, and the office was exported to numerous other countries between the 16th and 19th centuries. Further domestic reforms were implemented by Edward in the 1350s to better address the crisis engendered by the Black Death. The most noteworthy was undoubtedly a substantial reform of the English coinage, initiated in 1351. Gold coins were introduced, and a new silver coin called the groat also entered circulation. Edward was not an administrator with a proclivity for the intricacies of government reforms, such as those being undertaken in the early 1350s. However, his strength in this regard lay in his capacity to select individuals who were well suited to overseeing his domestic policies and delegating authority to them. Preeminent among these were officials such as John Thoresby and William Shershall, who supervised the implementation of measures such as the recoinage in the middle years of the century. The reform of England's finances was particularly necessary to sustain the perpetual war effort. The conflicts with France and Scotland had not abated, but the continent-wide emergency precipitated by the Black Death ensured that the truce Edward had negotiated with Philip VI late in 1347 was largely maintained throughout the late 1340s. The demise of the French king, Edward's long-standing adversary, on August 22, 1350, emboldened Edward to commence aggressively pursuing his claims in France again, against Jean II, Philip's son. However, a renewed French alliance with the Kingdom of Castile in Spain and the presence of a Castilian fleet in the English Channel in the early 1350s constrained Edward's ability to conduct any further invasion of France at this juncture. In the interim, the Succession War persisted in Brittany as a proxy of the 100 Years' War. As a consequence of this latter delay and the repercussions across Western Europe from the Black Death, no new major campaign would transpire in France until the mid-1350s. When it eventually materialized in 1355, Edward devised a two-pronged invasion, one directly across the English Channel to northern France, commencing in Normandy, with a subsidiary campaign being undertaken to the southwest in Gascony. The latter campaign through Gascony would feature one of Edward's sons in a prominent capacity for the first time. Edward and Queen Philippa had at least 12 children, born at regular intervals between 1330 and the mid-1350s. 9 of these survived beyond infancy, a high proportion for the late medieval period. Of these 9, 5 were sons and 4 were daughters. Edward's heir was his son and namesake, Edward, born in 1330 and known as the Black Prince. He would play a pivotal role in the war in France from the late 1350s onwards, having previously commanded a detachment at Crecy when he was merely 16 years of age, and having also been a founding member of the Order of the Garter 2 years later. Indeed, it was the Black Prince who commanded the campaign in Aquitaine in 1355. Of his other offspring, Edward's third oldest surviving son, John of Gaunt, so named after the town of Ghent, where he was born in 1355-1340, just 3 months prior to the Battle of Sluys, was also destined to play a significant role in the 100 Years' War, as well as in England's domestic politics in the final 15 or so years of Edward III's life. The dual expeditions of 1355 did not reach France until late in the year. The king himself led his expedition in person across the Channel to Calais in the very late autumn. However, news then arrived in France that the Scots had, once again, exploited the English engagements on the continent to invade northern England. Accordingly, Edward swiftly returned across the English Channel, and in January 1356, he led his final military campaign into Scotland, reasserting English authority over the border region. As a consequence of this about-face in northern France, the Black Prince's campaign to Aquitaine would prove far more consequential of the 2 English expeditions to France of the mid-1350s. The heir to the throne embarked with approximately 300 ships and several thousand men for southwest France in mid-September 1355 and was in Bordeaux by October. The military campaign season was nearly concluded by this time, but Edward Jr. conducted a brief foray inland towards Toulouse before withdrawing back to Bordeaux for the remainder of the winter. While the campaigns of 1355 had proven lackluster, that of 1356 was one of the most momentous of the 100 Years' War. The Black Prince set out in July on a grand chevauchée, an extended military raid through France. Advancing eastward through central France with a force of approximately 6,000 men, the Black Prince's forces razed several towns and villages, including Bourges, before doubling back towards Bordeaux in late August. It was during this maneuver that the French king, Jean II, opted to engage the English army. Jean might well have believed that the Black Prince was an inferior commander compared to his father. In any event, the French forces numbered over 10,000, holding a substantial numerical advantage over the English. However, if Jean II believed these factors would afford him the upper hand, he was grievously mistaken. At the ensuing Battle of Poitiers, which occurred on September 19, 1356, the Black Prince's forces decisively defeated the French yet again. A feigned retreat initially threw the French lines into disarray, and the English longbow was, once more, employed with devastating effect. Perhaps as many as 2,000 at the ensuing Battle of Poitiers, which occurred on September 19, 1356. The Black Prince's forces, with David II of Scotland still in English custody since the Battle of Neville's Cross 10 years prior, the kings of France and Scotland were now both Edward III's captives. This positioned the English king in a highly advantageous situation. He ultimately chose to ransom both in exchange for military, territorial, and political concessions. On October 3, 1357, the Treaty of Berwick was concluded with the Scots, whereby David II was released after 11 years in captivity. Edward Balliol had relinquished his claim to the Scottish throne in 1356, so Edward III could now have asserted his own claim to Scotland had he so desired. However, he opted for a more measured approach. David II was released in exchange for a ransom of 100,000 marks, or just under £67,000. However, the arrangement ensured Edward's final acceptance of the De Bruce king's suzerainty over Scotland, thus bringing the protracted Second Scottish War of Independence to a close after a quarter of a century of conflict. The arrangement ultimately reached in France in exchange for Jean II's release required more time to negotiate. In the interim, the French king was transported to England and detained at various locations, including the Tower of London. A preliminary treaty to release Jean and conclude the war was drafted in London in 1358. Through this, it was agreed that Edward would be acknowledged in his possession of Calais and granted the neighboring county of Poitiers in the north, around the modern-day region of Picardy, while the Duchy of Aquitaine would be expanded to encompass a significant portion of western France. A substantial ransom would also be paid in exchange for Jean's release. However, this draft agreement could not be finalized, and as a result, in 1359, Edward commenced preparations for a new military expedition against France and broadened his demands to include former English possessions in Normandy, as well as control over Maine and Anjou and suzerainty over the Duchy of Brittany. In return, Edward pledged to renounce all of his claims to the throne of France. However, the territorial concessions the English king was now seeking would have entailed England taking direct possession of nearly half of France and virtually the entirety of the north and west of the country. The French could not seriously contemplate acquiescing to this latest negotiating position, even with their king in English custody. Consequently, active military campaigning recommenced in the autumn of 1359, when an army of over 10,000 men, commanded by Edward himself, embarked across the Channel for Calais. A prolonged and destructive march through eastern and central France ensued in the following months, with Edward threatening, though not capturing, both Reims and Paris, although he was unable to secure a strategic victory that would have enhanced his bargaining power at renewed peace negotiations. By the late 1350s, the French were wary of engaging Edward and his English forces head-on, having endured multiple defeats against English armies that they significantly outnumbered over the preceding 15 or so years. Amidst this stalemate, negotiations recommenced in the early summer of 1360. The resulting peace or Treaty of Bretigny, so named after the town near Chartres where it was negotiated, was ultimately ratified by Edward on October 24, 1360. Under its terms, Jean II was to be released in exchange for an immense ransom of £500,000. Edward was to renounce his claims to the French throne, and in return, he would receive the territorial concessions that Jean had agreed to in London in 1358, Calais, the county of Poitiers, and an enlarged Duchy of Aquitaine. Ultimately, some of the provisions of the Treaty of Bretigny would never be ratified. Specifically, Edward was reluctant to relinquish all his claims to the crown of France, and Jean II was reticent about removing all claims he held to suzerainty over the Duchy of Aquitaine. Nevertheless, the treaty was agreed upon and would remain in effect for nearly a full decade. The treaty is typically regarded as marking the culmination of the first phase of the 100 Years' War. If one were to attempt to evaluate it in these terms, it would have to be concluded that the treaty signified a major triumph for England in that same conflict and marked arguably the zenith of Edward's reign. England's territorial holdings in France were more extensive as a consequence of the Treaty of Bretigny than they would be at any other juncture during the 100 Years' War. Clearly, then, the Peace of 1360 constituted a significant victory for Edward and ensured that during the 1360s, the English king could rest assured, cognizant that he was at the pinnacle of his authority in France and that the Scottish border had been securely stabilized with the arrangement reached with David II in 1357. In comparison to the 3 decades that had preceded it, the 1360s were a comparatively tranquil period of Edward's reign. The Peace of Bretigny would endure for nearly the entirety of the 1360s, and as a consequence, England enjoyed the first period of sustained peace of Edward III's long reign. Given the entirely advantageous footing the country was on by the time the first stage of the 100 Years' War concluded in 1360, this was hardly an undesirable circumstance. On the domestic front, there were a number of significant developments during these years. For example, in 1362, with the assent of Parliament, Edward embarked on reforming the wool staple, the mechanism whereby wool was exported from England. The objective now was to establish a new staple at Calais for the export of wool to the continent through a single continental port. The initiative held considerable significance, as the English wool trade, arguably the nation's most valuable export commodity for the ensuing 3 centuries, was largely conducted through markets in northern France, and, above all, in the Low Countries, through the thriving mercantile hub of Antwerp. For many years to come after the reform of the staple in the 1360s, in endeavoring to establish a staple at Calais, Edward was anticipating the market demands of the 15th and 16th centuries. Yet the most substantial domestic reform of the 1360s pertained to the English language. When the Normans conquered England between 1066 and the early 1070s, they introduced the French language and established it as the language of government and the law courts. During the course of the 11th and 12th centuries, a new language evolved, a hybrid of Norman French and the Germanic tongue spoken by the Anglo-Saxons prior to the Norman conquest. This English language, known as Middle English, had become the vernacular of the English people by Edward III's reign. However, French remained the language of the courts and government nonetheless. Edward sought to overhaul this. In 1362, a statute of pleading was enacted, mandating the use of English in the law courts. Similarly, when Parliament convened in 1363, the opening formalities were conducted in English rather than French for the first time. Consequently, the 1360s witnessed a number of significant advancements in the formal adoption of English as the language of government and the courts in England. Elsewhere, the 1360s were also a crucial period in the governance of the Lordship of Ireland. Due to the emphasis on France and Scotland during the majority of his reign, Edward had been unable to dedicate much personal attention to Ireland, a country where the English crown ruled approximately half of the eastern, northern, and southern portions of the island. A number of Irish lordships governed the western half of the country and continued to challenge English dominion there. Accordingly, in the early 1360s, Edward entrusted the governance of Ireland to his second eldest surviving son, Lionel of Clarence. This appointment yielded significant results in the subsequent years. In 1366, a parliament was convened in the town of Kilkenny in the Irish Midlands, during which a series of statutes were promulgated to segregate the English from the Irish in Ireland and safeguard the English regions of Ireland from Irish incursions. The Statutes of Kilkenny, as they became known, would serve to insulate the English of Ireland from Irish cultural interference in the ensuing decades. For instance, the statutes prescribed intermarriage between the Irish and English and implemented measures to prevent the English of Ireland from adopting Irish cultural and political customs. These measures substantially curtailed any potential decline of English power in Ireland during the mid-14th century and, in one form or another, constituted a major foundational basis of the English lordship of Ireland through to the early 16th century. While the 1360s were a relatively placid period of Edward's reign, the final decade in which he reigned, the 1370s, would present new challenges. Yet, any assessment of Edward III's reign and his legacy must acknowledge that the king was not the central figure in the governance of the realm during the last 7 or 8 years of his reign. We initially encounter indications of Edward's declining health in 1369, at the age of 57. He would survive for another 8 years, but there are clear signs that the king was experiencing an increasing number of ailments, both physical and cognitive, as the 1370s progressed. As with numerous instances of illness in medieval monarchs, it is impossible to ascertain with certainty what Edward was actually suffering from during his final years. However, it appears that the most severe of his maladies might have been caused by a series of strokes that he endured in the last 8 or so years of his life. These afflictions undoubtedly curtailed Edward's involvement in the governance of his realms, but he still participated, although by the 1370s, the daily operations of government were increasingly managed by his sons and extended family. Nevertheless, some significant events can be attributed to Edward, even in his concluding years. Paramount among these was the resumption of the war in France. Peace had prevailed for the better part of a decade since the settlement of 1360, but this was becoming progressively more fragile as time passed. Charles V had succeeded his father, John II, as King of France in May 1364. The son was a more assertive figure who, in the ensuing years, endeavored to re-establish the strength of the French monarchy after the setbacks it had endured during the 1340 and 1350. For instance, he entered into a reconciliation with Charles of Navarre, the small kingdom on the southern border of France. More conspicuously, the French king reasserted the suzerainty of the French monarchy over the Duchy of Brittany. However, The catalyst for renewed conflict with England emerged when Charles exploited internal discord within the Duchy of Aquitaine in 1369 to demand that the Black Prince appear before him. When the heir to the English throne refused to comply, Charles V declared the Duchy of Aquitaine forfeit, instantly reigniting the dormant Hundred Years' War. In response, in the summer of 1369, Edward revived his claim to the throne of France, which he had agreed to relinquish in 1360. Consequently, the war was rejoined just as Edward's health was beginning to decline at the end of the 1360s. This new chapter in the conflict between England and France was a fundamentally distinct affair from those of the 1340s and 1350s. For one thing, Edward would not personally lead an invasion of France, and the execution of military campaigns was to be largely undertaken by Edward's sons, the Black Prince and John of Gaunt. Notably, in this regard, Edward had intended to lead an expedition to France himself when the conflict initially erupted in 1369, but he had to abandon his plans, and it was eventually John who commanded this army when it crossed the Channel. Furthermore, in this new phase of the war, the conflict between England and France became increasingly intertwined with a series of civil wars and interstate conflicts in Spain involving the two major powers there, the kingdoms of Castile and Aragon. It is perhaps a reflection on how much the triumphs of the 1340 and 1350 had been contingent on the dynamic leadership and brilliant generalship of Edward III that, in this latest phase of the war, England faltered without the old king's direct involvement. Much of the Duchy of Aquitaine was overrun in the early 1370s, partly because the Castilians, with whom the French had allied, managed to defeat the English at sea off La Rochelle in southwestern France in June 1372. This defeat restricted the extent to which the English territories on the continent could be resupplied from England. A major campaign was undertaken in 1373 in an attempt to reverse the defeats that English arms had suffered between 1369 and 1372. This grand chevauchée, or raid, was led by John of Gaunt and proceeded from Calais south through eastern France and then west to Bordeaux. Although it left considerable devastation in its wake, it was a strategic failure and did not achieve its primary objective of reimposing English authority in Brittany. As a result, by the mid-1370s, without Edward's leadership to rely upon, the English position in France was significantly diminished and was largely confined to Calais in the north and the coastal regions of Gascony, including the town of Bordeaux. It was with English fortunes at this low point that Pope Gregory XI offered to mediate a peace between the belligerents in 1374. The resulting treaty, known as the Treaty of Bruges, was agreed upon on June 27, 1375. It afforded England time to regroup, but was unpopular domestically, largely because the peace had witnessed the weakening of the English position in the north of France. Yet, it would not endure. The question of the sovereignty of the Duchy of Aquitaine was not resolved by this latest treaty, and in the months ahead, this became a cause for renewed unrest. The English desired Aquitaine to be entirely liberated from French sovereignty, a move that would ensure that the kings of England would never again have to pay homage to the monarchs of France. While Charles V was, understandably, reluctant to effectively abandon any claim he possessed over the duchy, war would swiftly resume again concerning this issue, and several others in 1377. However, when it did, it would be the responsibility of the government of Edward's successor to oversee it. While the final years of Edward's reign witnessed some setbacks in France, on the domestic front, a number of crises were navigated with commendable skill. These primarily concerned the matter of financing a renewed period of war on the continent. In 1371 and again in 1373, parliaments were convened to obtain a loan and subsidy from the lords and gentry of England. In both instances, Edward had to make several concessions to the political nation to secure the necessary financing, notably by replacing a number of his senior ministers who were churchmen with lay officials. Yet resentment was accumulating regarding the kingdom's finances throughout the decade, which culminated in 1376 in a parliament convened just 1 year before Edward's death, known to history as the Good Parliament. This latest assembly was summoned to provide further funding for the crown. When it convened in April 1376, however, it seized the opportunity to articulate a series of accumulated grievances, particularly concerning several of Edward's advisors. John of Gaunt also became a target of Parliament, especially so during the summer of 1376, when the Black Prince succumbed to dysentery on June 8th. A relatively amicable series of solutions were eventually reached, whereby the councillors who had offended the political nation were dismissed and some further reforms implemented. Consequently, the end of Edward's life witnessed the English Parliament functioning as a mechanism of redress for the English political community in a manner that would break down in later times. That this was averted, and with it England spared any form of revolt during Edward's long reign, is a testament to the stability of his reign on the domestic front, despite the recurring strains of financing prolonged wars in France and Scotland. However, that stability was fracturing. It would have been evident to the assembled parliamentarians and nobles in London in 1376 that the king's health was deteriorating precipitously. At the age of 64, and after nearly half a century on the English throne, in late September, he became gravely ill from a large abscess. Days later, he was making final amendments to his will in anticipation of his imminent death. However, it did not come. Rather, the old monarch rallied in the subsequent weeks. However, early in February 1377, the abscess ruptured. As a result, his movements were severely restricted for the remaining months of his life. When he passed away at Sheen Palace, where Richmond Palace would subsequently be constructed, near London on June 21st, 1377, it was almost certainly from another stroke. He was 64 years old. He died having accomplished so much in his lifetime, in a long and influential reign as England's monarch. The most significant chronicler of Edward's reign and the first half of the 100 Years' War, Jean Froissart, wrote poignantly of Edward's death and funeral in his chronicles, an event Froissart himself witnessed. On 21st June 1377, the gallant and noble King Edward III departed this life, to the deep distress of the whole realm of England, for he had been a good king for them. His like had not been seen since the days of King Arthur, who once had also been King of England, which in his time was called Great Britain. So King Edward was embalmed and placed with great pomp and reverence on a bier borne by 24 knights dressed in black, his 3 sons and the Duke of Brittany and the Earl of March walking behind him, and carried thus at a slow march through the city of London, the face uncovered. To witness and hear the grief of the people, their sobs and screams and lamentations on that day, would have rendered anyone's heart. It was a fitting final journey for one of England's greatest kings. Edward was succeeded by his grandson Richard, the son of the Black Prince, a mere 10 years old at the time of his accession. Richard II would reign until he was usurped by his cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, in 1399. Richard's reign would be characterized by military setbacks and widespread social unrest within England, the most significant being the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. His reliance, like that of his great-grandfather, Edward II, on a coterie of favorites, aroused widespread discontent throughout the Plantagenet realms and foreshadowed the Wars of the Roses of the 15th century. Consequently, Edward III's reign appears all the more remarkable in retrospect for having been an oasis of stability amidst the turmoil that otherwise characterized England's politics throughout the 14th and 15th centuries. There is little doubt that Edward was one of England's most substantial and successful monarchs ever. In the 19th century, a generation of historians began to denigrate the king and questioned whether his reign could be deemed a success. However, this perspective is problematic, as the writers of the Victorian era attempted to impose their own value systems on the appraisal of Edward, rather than evaluating the king on his own terms as a late medieval monarch. For a king who was born and lived in warfare, the moral concerns of later generations would have made little sense. Indeed, imposing moral judgments on the actions of individuals who lived centuries ago is always problematic. More recently, historians such as Ian Mortimer and William Ormrod have successfully rehabilitated Edward III's reputation. While there is no denying that Edward's final years witnessed some setbacks, particularly in France, he was, at this time, severely ill, and authority had largely devolved to his sons. When we disregard this latter period, there is no disputing the success of Edward's reign. Under his rule, England attained the zenith of its power during the medieval era. At points between the 1330s and 1360s, Edward was not merely the ruler of England, Wales, and a significant portion of Ireland, but he was also able to impose his authority relatively thoroughly on Scotland and extensive sections of northern and western France. Some of the territorial acquisitions were either permanent, as in the case of Berwick on the Anglo-Scottish border, or long-lasting, as in the case of the town of Calais in northern France. Furthermore, the 100 Years' War, which he initiated, was a crucial component in the eventual formation of England and France into modern nation-states, owing to the manner in which it drew upon their administrative and financial resources and fostered a nascent sense of patriotism through national endeavor. Indeed, when Edward dispatched requests for men and funds throughout his dominions to finance his campaigns in France, he was effectively instructing his local officials to devise more efficient methods of taxing the country and exploiting its resources. This is the very foundation of the modern nation-state, one that is expertly positioned to exploit the resources available to it to the maximum extent possible in the name of government. Much of this territorial expansion was achieved on the basis of both Edward's exceptional abilities as a general and the military revolution that he oversaw. During his rule, the English longbow rendered England the military superpower of its time. At Halidon Hill, Crecy, Neville's Cross, Poitiers, and several other battles, English armies consistently managed to vanquish French and Scottish armies that were substantially numerically superior to those commanded by Edward and his nobles. Moreover, an English army was quite possibly the first to utilize field cannons in all of Europe at Crecy in 1346. Nor was Edward's military prowess confined to land. As at Sluys in 1340, Edward demonstrated how effective the English longbow could be, even at sea. Given all this, there is little doubt that Edward III should be regarded as one of the great commanders of English and British military history, a figure who stands alongside John Churchill, 1st Duke of Marlborough, whose command of England's forces during the War of the Spanish Succession in the early 18th century propelled England to the rank of major powers in Europe, or perhaps even Arthur Wellesley, 1st Duke of Wellington, whose successful prosecution of the Peninsular War in Portugal and Spain, which transpired between 1807 and 1814, became the bane of Napoleon's dominance of Europe, while Wellington was also pivotal to Bonaparte's final defeat at Waterloo in 1815. Certainly, Edward III's legacy as a military commander likely surpasses that of his grandfather, Edward I. While he may not have been able to convert his military victories as successfully into political triumphs, there is little doubt that Edward III was a more adept commander on the field of battle. However, Edward's legacy should not be solely measured by assessing his prowess on the battlefield. In the late 1340s, he established the Order of the Garter, England's highest chivalric order to this day, and in doing so, contributed to England being considered the most chivalrous kingdom in Western Europe at the height of the Middle Ages. As a further testament to the world of his rule, he also re-edified and expanded Windsor Castle as a symbol of English royal power. Another enduring achievement was witnessed in the late 1340 and early 1350, when Edward successfully navigated England through the crisis precipitated by the arrival of the bubonic plague in Europe. The Black Death was the gravest crisis faced by Europe during the late Middle Ages. Perhaps as much as a third of England's population perished within the span of half a decade. However, rather than succumbing psychologically to the onslaught of illness and death that ravaged England in the late 1340s, Edward guided the country through this period by stabilizing the economy through the enactment of the Statute of Laborers. Furthermore, in strengthening the office of the Justice of the Peace to effectively implement the statute at the local level in England, Edward's government made a lasting contribution to English local administration, one that was subsequently exported to Ireland, North America, India, and Australia in later centuries. Yet, in many other respects, Edward's reign and its success were about long-term nation-building. Parliament became more significant during his reign, and he began to utilize many of the emblems that came to symbolize England itself, notably carrying the Cross of St. George into battle. However, perhaps Edward's most profound legacy was in the reorientation of the courts and government to favor Middle English as the language of government and officialdom in England. As a result, in the centuries that followed, when England and subsequently Britain began establishing colonies elsewhere across the globe, it was English that was disseminated globally as the language of England and Britain. There is no disputing the significance of Edward III to all these pivotal developments of the 14th century, making him perhaps England's greatest king. What are your thoughts on King Edward III? Was he England's greatest ever king? And if so, is he unjustly overlooked today? Please share your thoughts in the comment section, and in the meantime, I extend my sincere gratitude for watching.